In 2004, the New Zealand SAS received something almost no foreign unit ever gets, a personal award from the President of the United States. George W. Bush gave the entire unit a Presidential Unit Citation for their operations in Afghanistan, putting them alongside the American Special Operations Forces as one of the most trusted units in the war on terror. By 2010, the New Zealand SAS had completed over 90% of their raids without firing a single shot. General David Petraeus publicly praised them for 60 high-risk arrests of suspected militants and Taliban leaders. But here is what almost nobody outside New Zealand knows. Their own government had placed strict geographic restrictions on where the New Zealand SAS could operate, and when those boundaries were pushed during a retaliatory night raid in August 2010, it triggered civilian deaths, a decade of lies, and the most damaging military scandal in New Zealand history. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to the beginning. The NZ SAS was formed in 1955, modeled on the British SAS. From the jungles of Borneo to Vietnam to East Timor, they built a quiet reputation as one of the most capable small nation special forces in the world. New Zealand only has about 5 million people. Its entire military is smaller than a single US Army division. So when the NZ SAS punches above its weight, people in the special operations community notice. In 2007, Corporal Willie Apiata became a national hero after earning the Victoria Cross for carrying a critically wounded comrade 70 meters across open, fire-swept ground during an Afghan ambush. His citation said that it was scarcely possible that neither man was hit during that run. When the US invaded Afghanistan in late 2001, New Zealand was among the first to send special forces. The NZ SAS deployed almost immediately, conducting long-range vehicle patrols through some of the most hostile terrain in southern Afghanistan, alongside US Marines. That first deployment ran until 2005, and it earned the unit immense respect from coalition partners. But New Zealand also deployed something very different in 2003, a provincial reconstruction team to Bamiyan province in the Central Highlands. Around 140 personnel building roads, bridges, and schools. Over a decade, they delivered more than 200 development projects worth over $100 million. Bamiyan was relatively peaceful. The mostly Hazara population had been persecuted by the Taliban, and they largely welcomed the international presence. From 2008 onward, that changed. Roadside bombs and ambushes with rocket-propelled grenades increased. The Taliban were probing the province, testing for weakness. This is where the national caveats come in. When any nation sends troops to a coalition like NATO's ISAF in Afghanistan, they set formal restrictions called national caveats. These dictate where troops can go, what operations they can join, and under what conditions. Some nations banned night operations. Others restricted forces to specific provinces. The Germans famously had to return to base before nightfall. Italian special forces could only operate within their own regional command area. American and British commanders constantly complained they could not get Allied forces to fight where needed because of these political handcuffs. For New Zealand, when the NZ SAS redeployed in late September 2009, Cabinet authorized them for Kabul and adjacent provinces, working alongside the Afghan Crisis Response Unit. The Chief of Defense Force retained full command, and the government held a red card veto over any operation that went beyond the approved mandate. These were not suggestions. They were formal constraints communicated to NATO and accepted as conditions of New Zealand's contribution. The NZ SAS operated from Camp Warehouse on Kabul's eastern outskirts and were extraordinarily effective. But the reconstruction team down in Bamiyan had no special forces protection, and in the summer of 2010, that became a serious problem. If you are watching this and learning something new, hit subscribe. I cover military history and special forces stories every week. On August 3, 2010, Lieutenant Tim O'Donnell was leading a 4-vehicle patrol through Karimak village in northeast Bamiyan when the lead Humvee struck a roadside bomb. The explosion destroyed the armored vehicle. O'Donnell was killed instantly. Two other soldiers, Lance Corporal Matthew Ball and Private Alistair Baker, suffered serious burns and broken bones. A local interpreter was also wounded. O'Donnell was 28 years old. He had been decorated for bravery in East Timor, where he rescued hundreds of people during a violent political rally. He was New Zealand's first combat fatality in Afghanistan, and the news hit the small military community like a shockwave. The reaction among New Zealand forces was intense. O'Donnell's death generated an outpouring of grief and a burning desire for retribution. Intelligence officers at Kiwi Base in Bamyan used local informants and an electronic eavesdropping station to identify 9 suspected insurgent fighters they believed were responsible. The New Zealand Special Air Service lobbied U.S. military authorities to add 3 of these men to the Joint Prioritized Effects List, a coalition capture or kill list. The targets were from 2 small villages, Naik and Kut Dad, in the remote Tirgaran Valley in Baghlan Province, roughly 50 kilometers across the mountains from the New Zealand base. This is critical. Baghlan was outside the Special Air Service's normal operational zone. The government authorized the mission because the targets directly threatened New Zealand's reconstruction team. Defense Minister Wayne Mapp and Chief of Defense Force Jerry Mataparai were in Afghanistan at the time and were briefed on the plan. Prime Minister John Key gave the green light by phone from New Zealand. On the evening of August 21st, between 60 and 70 Special Air Service and Afghan Crisis Response Unit troops loaded into U.S. Chinook helicopters, staged through Kiwi Base in Bamyan and launched the early morning raid on August 22nd. The plan was textbook special forces. Encircle the villages, snipers on high ground, assault teams storm the buildings. U.S. Apache helicopter gunships hovered overhead. Senior officers watched a live video feed from the SAS operations room in Kabul. What happened next became the subject of a $7 million government inquiry, a best-selling book, and the worst military scandal in New Zealand's modern history. None of the targeted insurgents were in the villages. The intelligence was wrong, but the operation did not end when the targets were not found. U.S. Apache helicopters fired cannon rounds and rockets into buildings in both Naik and Kut Dad. NZ SAS snipers engaged individuals who were fleeing. Ground teams swept through houses, using flashbang grenades to clear rooms. By the time the operation was over, civilians were dead. A young child was killed, reportedly hit by shrapnel while in her mother's arms. Multiple people were wounded. Houses were destroyed or burned. Hundreds of villagers later staged protests in the nearby district center, demanding that the soldiers responsible be punished. The exact toll became the subject of fierce dispute, but the government inquiry would later confirm that at least 5 people died, including the child, and that civilians were among the casualties. And then came the part that in many ways was worse than the raid itself. The cover-up. The New Zealand Defence Force told ministers and the public that allegations of civilian casualties were unfounded. They maintained this for nearly 7 years. Senior SAS officers sent emails stating there was no evidence of casualties, even though video footage and ISAF's own media releases contradicted this. Someone within the SAS deleted a video that appeared to show the funeral of a dead child. Officers edited reports to remove references to possible civilian casualties. Ministers were misled. Prime Minister Key was told there was no way civilian casualties could have occurred. Years later, former Defense Minister Wayne Mapp would privately describe Operation Burnham as our biggest and most disastrous operation. About 10 days later, the NZ SAS returned for a second raid. According to SAS personnel, they destroyed houses villagers had rebuilt after the first operation. In January 2011, the NZ SAS detained one of the original targets, Kari Mirage. An NZ SAS trooper punched the prisoner while he was bound and blindfolded, then handed him to Afghanistan's National Directorate of Security, despite knowing the NDS routinely tortured detainees. Kari Mirage was tortured. When the NZDF found out, they did nothing. The truth only started coming out in 2017 when investigative journalists Nikki Hager and John Stevenson published a book called Hit and Run. It was based on interviews with SAS personnel, Afghan civilians, and leaked military documents. The book alleged war crimes and a systematic cover-up by the Defense Force. The initial response from the military was predictable. Chief of Defense Force Tim Keating held a press conference and said the book was wrong, that it was not even about an operation the NZDF had conducted. He focused on minor location discrepancies to discredit the entire account. But the public outcry was enormous. Filmmaker Peter Jackson, Amnesty International, and even conservative commentators called for an inquiry. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's government established one in April 2018, led by a former Supreme Court judge and a former Prime Minister. It cost $7 million and it took 2 years. The inquiry report, released in July 2020, was devastating. It confirmed civilian deaths, including a child. It confirmed that an NZ SAS trooper assaulted a bound prisoner who was then tortured after being handed to Afghan intelligence. Delivering a detainee to an agency known for torture put New Zealand in breach of the Geneva Conventions. 4 former NZ SAS commanding officers were found to have acted improperly. One sent a misleading email denying casualties that the inquiry called inexcusable. Another directed a subordinate to remove words from a report acknowledging civilian deaths. The inquiry described the Defense Force's handling as deeply troubling, but the inquiry also found that the NZ SAS soldiers on the ground acted professionally and within the rules of engagement. The failures were in the intelligence and in everything that happened afterward. The government accepted all recommendations, including establishing an independent military inspector general. So what does this story actually tell us? It tells us why national caveats exist. Small nations set geographic restrictions on their forces because the consequences of things going wrong in someone else's war are catastrophic. The NZ SAS was authorized for Kabul. When they went beyond that boundary to pursue insurgents linked to a New Zealand death, the decision chain went all the way to the Prime Minister, and it still went wrong. It tells us that the secrecy that makes special forces effective can also be used to hide terrible mistakes. For nearly a decade, the NZ SAS's operational security was used not to protect soldiers, but to protect reputations. The people who paid the price for that were Afghan villagers who never got an apology, and New Zealand soldiers who were never told the truth about what their own unit had done. The New Zealand SAS withdrew from Afghanistan on March 31st, 2012. 2 soldiers, Corporal Douglas Grant and Lance Corporal Leon Smith, had been killed during the Kabul deployment. Once the SAS left, the reconstruction team in Bamyan lost its ability to target insurgents. Commanders reported that key Taliban figures were walking through New Zealand checkpoints unchallenged. The reconstruction team left in April 2013. When the Taliban swept back to power in 2021, thousands of Afghans who had worked alongside coalition forces were left behind. Former SAS soldier Jamie Pennell, who had worked with about 200 crisis response unit personnel, later learned that only 70 made it out. That hit him hard, he said publicly, and it raised an even bigger question. What did any of it actually accomplish? The caveats were there for a reason. When they were stretched, people died.